Hi, James. Welcome to the podcast Under the Gulmohar Tree. We are really lucky to have you here today. You have a great mix of business and political experience and training. Can you please do a quick introduction for our audience?
Yes, and thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure. I speak for in a lot of podcasts, but I think this one is particularly of interest to me for various reasons. So, just to give you a little camera glimpse into my life, I began at a very early age working for a family office, the founder of General Motors, family office and foundation. And this was a very unique opportunity for me at a very early age. But what it did for me was to really pretty much pattern the rest of my life and what I did following that, which I'll share a little bit in the future as well. But what happened to us, two very distinct things happened. So this was at age 19. I was also selected to be a Rotary International Fellow, and I was sent to the Soviet Union. And my role in this trip was to meet with all the heads of the Politburo agencies. So I was meeting at age 19, I was meeting with Politburo agency heads that I said were 4 times my girth and 6 times my age. So I would go into these grand old Soviet offices and have conversations with them, which was very interesting because they felt that their economy was the absolute best and the way they handled it was the absolute best. So it was interesting to find about their viewpoints, but also to talk to people on the streets of both Moscow and Leningrad. So that was a very interesting thing. So when I went back to the Mott Foundation and Family Office, 3 weeks after I began, we heard automatic machine gun fire coming through the front plate glass door of our office. And we were thrown under our desks. I grabbed my phone. I didn't know if we were going to survive or not, though it was obvious that we were not the value play. They were after the gentleman who was the founder's son, and he was running the family office and foundation at that time, and he was put into a room-sized safe. So he was kept without harm. We were taken down the fire escape 5 hours after, and the police had obviously taken care of and had captured these criminals. But this is really why I'm telling you this story, not just the drama of it. 3 weeks after that, this gentleman came to me and he said, I'd like you to create, basically, we didn't use this term then, but an algorithm that would tell us whether we're having an impact by our investing and by our philanthropy. So this was the first time, this was before the word impact was actually used. At that time, we only used the word impact to describe a head-on collision between two vehicles. So I began to look for ways that we could, and this features into some of the, I know what your audience is interested in, and that is, in order to have an investment strategy and a philanthropic strategy, I felt that, and this is what he was asking for, that we could actually show precise return on investment. And so I did both. One was, as I said, on the investment side, one was on the philanthropic side. And then I had to present it to the board of directors. And the average age of the board members was 86 years old, and I was 20. So I thought, well, why are they going to listen to me? But I made a presentation in front of them all at their board meeting, and they accepted it unanimously. So I think for about 15 years, that organization used this template to ask the question and to answer the question, are we having an impact both to our assets in terms of asset management and to our philanthropy by what we're doing? And this was fascinating because it was just very, I would say, premature really of the movement that's happened over the past 10 to 15 years to address all of our economies, and this is a global push. It isn't unique to the U.S. to answer the question, are we having an impact on people's lives, their livelihood, their health? All of these different things have really come up into a highly and also, I would say, very debatable conversation about how the whole field of impact should be handled. And now we're seeing a different shift away from some of the tactics and strategies that have been used. So that is what started me on my career. And then years after this, I was actually invited into the White House by President Reagan to start his first White House office on impact. And people say to me often, well, because Reagan was a Republican, oh no, there was no impact office in the White House. And I assuredly, I can tell you as much as I'm alive that there was an impact office in the White House, which was an interesting way that we were able to do that. We improved public housing, public education, public health, public transportation by bringing the private sector and the public sector together. So that was a very interesting and obviously a wonderful, wonderful part of my life, because I was not only doing this, but I was also a chief of staff in the White House. I was able to travel the world and negotiate with foreign governments on behalf of the president, along with our negotiating teams. That included China, Russia, and various other, Japan, South Korea, and other places as well. So that gave me a wonderful view of not only what these countries, the richness of these countries and their culture, but also how to negotiate at a presidential level. So that was very interesting to me. So I'll stop, but that's just a little bit of a story about my career and what it is, and which I'm so grateful for. And then I've continued in this company that I started, GrowthStrategy, which is all about growth and strategy.
James, thank you for such a wonderful story. Maybe give us a little bit more color into when you were working with President Reagan, you got to see the world from a very different lens. Leadership under pressure. You already talked to us about a situation that you were in during very early career. What were the takeaways from that leadership under pressure, having multiple stakeholders, and how do you take that forward in your career today?
Well, as it refers to my years in the White House, I learned a tremendous amount related to leadership. And I think also you could see that in Reagan's leadership, it was based very deeply and strongly in his values. And he believed very much that America had a role to play, but not just for its own benefit. This is very important. Ronald Reagan felt that America had been placed here and created to help the rest of the world and not to be isolated. And because of the freedom of speech, the freedom to build companies, to use capitalism as the best way to end poverty and to give people an opportunity to grow and to establish businesses that would be profitable for them and their families and for their workers. That is a part of what he considered to be the platform of America and its reason for being here. And so everywhere we went in the world, Reagan was a freedom. He was a freedom evangelist, basically. So he would speak, and he would give, in his speeches, he wanted to give hope to people around the world that they could persist and that they had the right and they had the promise, eventually, he hoped, of being free. And one of the most remarkable scenes to me was I went to cultivate I went to farms with him where workers were cultivating crops and they were hoeing by hand where the crops were being seeded and where they were growing. And they called Reagan Freedom Man. Hey, Freedom Man. And he would stand in the field with them and talk to them about freedom. And he was not concerned for anyone to hear him talking about it, because he felt that every person deserved to live a free life where they could, as I say, develop these skills and improve the welfare of their families and themselves. The same thing when he spoke in Russia at the University of Moscow. He spoke out very pointedly and very strongly about freedom and how this was a God-given gift and that every human being deserved to have freedom and not to be kept under the bondage of particular political entities. And this was something that was very, I would say he had a tremendous amount of courage to do this, but it was because he was convicted. He had no reservation about sharing these values. And as a result, I think politically it had an impact on the leaders to a certain degree of these countries. And of course, in particularly in Russia and what was the Soviet Union. He had an enormous impact. Wherever he went, Reagan was well liked, not just by conservatives or by Republicans. I remember one time going in a city in the U.S. that was known to be heavily Democratic, and we went into a bar where we were visiting. It was I think it was a campaign period, and this city was highly Democrat, and there was no evidence of that when they greeted Reagan when he came into the bar. They were hugging him, talking to him. There was just a tremendous amount of, I think, interest on both parties in supporting Reagan. And even today, if I might be walking down the street and someone finds out that I worked in the Reagan White House, no matter what their age, they say, could you just talk to me about Reagan? Could you just talk to me about Reagan? I wasn't born then, but I've heard about him. And they want to hear these stories. And speaking of stories, Reagan did a lot of his communicating, and he was called the best communicator, a great communicator, I should say. And one of the things he was very good about communicating so well was to tell stories and to use them as object lessons. So even if he was telling a joke, he would tell a joke that had a political meaning, or it could be memorable. And this is how I learned. My third book that I wrote is Winning Your Audience. And I have been asked to coach any number of business leaders about how to communicate exactly, or much like Ronald Reagan did. So these were all things that were critically important. I think there are many stories related to this, and I don't want to bore your audience. I think one of the most meaningful was the first meeting between Gorbachev and Reagan, which was in Geneva, and this was the way Reagan wanted to pursue this. Our team went over 6 times in small Air Force planes to negotiate with the Russian team. The first 2 meetings we had were completely unproductive because they were the old strategy that the Soviet Union had. The new strategy was workable because it was the Gorbachev team. And you could see that they were much more adept at negotiating, and that we were going to be able to go ahead with productive bilateral meetings between the two heads. But Reagan he wanted to meet, very importantly, and this was somewhat controversial, he wanted to meet one-on-one with Gorbachev alone as the first meeting. And it was an example of how Reagan's confidence, but also his desire to meet another leader on a level of values. And he felt that if he could conquer that, and that if he could really, in a way, develop a relationship that was not only viable and held a future, but also where there was a discussion about shared values. And that's one of the most important things that happened there. Anyway, I don't want to, there are hours and hours of stories I could tell you, but I want this to be useful for you and your audience.
Thank you so much, James. No, that was super helpful. Talking about the Freeman, the Reagan White House, um, I'm sure you're following the US and Canada story about tariffs and the ad that was run um, by Ontario and is supposed to be run again by some other provinces. Can you talk to us a little bit more about thinking about tariffs in that White House?
Reagan was opposed to tariffs, and it was considered. There's no question, especially in one bilateral arrangement. But Reagan was, and it was also a different time, so you have to take this into consideration politically. So this was a time when there was more, I think, global discussion and communication between and beginning, I should say, also with multilateral negotiations. So there were heads of companies that were negotiating with companies in other countries. There was I think a much more of an opening with regard to dialogue and to negotiation. And so I think that also drove the idea of tariffs, put it into a position where it was not necessary. But that no question, on trade, we had a very active trade commission, and which was very actively involved in countries all over the world. But that what we were able to do, or what they were able to do at the time, was to negotiate satisfactory agreements, because it was also because it was a different era. So I can see perhaps in some ways why Trump went this way with his strategies, because during the Trump era, it was a bit easier to negotiate trade policy with other countries that were producing things that were being consumed in the U.S. and vice versa, because they were beginning to do things that the marketplace needed in the U.S. and again on the opposite side. Now we've been living in an economy that is much more aggressive in terms of both our manufacturing partners in other parts of the world, and a lot has been shifted away from the US to other countries. And I think all that has to be taken into consideration to protect the US economy. So I can understand why tariffs have been considered a value play and a strategy to use, but we'll have to see if that was the right way to go. But that's just perhaps a little window on why Reagan didn't want tariffs and didn't push tariffs, and why they're being pushed today.
Got it. That was super helpful. No, thank you so much for touching on that topic. It is critical, as we know right now. Now, let's apply those lessons to business and strategy today, like you were talking about. If you had to distill all the learnings from your, call it politics and business experience, and distill it into a growth strategy playbook, high rates, AI disruption, valuation gaps, what are some of the non-negotiables from your playbook? And what are the recommendations for the founders and CEOs to adapt to this environment today?
Well, I think first of all, in the case of negotiations with other economies, in the US, it's your job to protect the economy for the American people. You don't have to protect the economies of other countries. This is your, as an American official, either in the private sector or the public sector, and in Congress as well. It's your job to protect the livelihood and the ability of the American people to be successful and to have successful companies and to benefit the American market. I think that's critically important to say that first. And I think that you could see that it's important. I think communication is obviously critically important, but these other countries that obviously we have multilateral relationships with, and very often very good ones, have, for example, in Western Europe, they have forfeited a lot of growth, and their economies are suffering because of that. And so you can see the whole tariff issue for Western Europe really has to be addressed, or let's say the economies of Western Europe has to be addressed. The in the East, you have a completely different situation. You have aggressive countries that want to dominate markets. So what you have is you have an almost untenable situation. There are a lot of things that have to be corrected. And so I agree with President Trump in what his basic strategy is to make these multilateral and bilateral relations to be more, not only more workable, but more beneficial to the American people. I truly believe that is his motive. The question is this the best strategy to achieve that?
Got it. Thank you so much. Now, let's connect the dots to your book, where in Winning Your Audience, you outline how leaders can speak with confidence of a president. What is the single most important principle CEOs should embrace while communicating with the investors, board members, and employees? Those are the stakeholders that we as CEOs have.
I think that we are in a time of communication deficit. A lot of this has to do with the migration of our communication to digital platforms. But do digital platforms really perform what we need in terms of employee relations and investor relations and in the media? There's a lot of, I would say, speculation about whether using digital platforms and I don't mean digital platforms like the way we're speaking now, but to be able to communicate. There's been a tremendous rise, obviously, in using platforms like X, multiple platforms where people actually communicate in a certain way, where I think CEOs and other leaders in different fields feel that a lot can be said, but the question is, what is the effect and the result of what they're saying? And it's the digital platforms have really provided a platform for, or let me start that over again. the digital platforms have provided what a lot of people consider to be a low-cost pathway to communicate, either with shareholders, employees, investors, partners, and I'm not sure that it works all the time, and it has also taken away the personal communication that people crave. So let's take some of these companies as examples, and Boeing is one where I think they've had a succession of CEOs, and communication with both customers and employees, and also with business partners. I think that the communication on the part of corporate leadership has gone to a very low level in terms of its the ability for people to see that there is that there's a real relationship. And to have a real relationship, for a leader to have a real relationship, there has to be what I call bridge building. And bridge building is when you show interest in your constituency. And if you build a bridge, people will cross it and come to you. But without a bridge, the audience that you're trying to affect, which again can be employees, it can be shareholders, it leaves them without a way to reach you. And a lot of, I would say, companies are led by people who don't want to be necessarily reached by their shareholders and their employees. So they have heads of investor relations, they have PR people, they're speaking for them. And I think that the level of leadership in the world, I won't say it's just unique to the US, but the level of brilliant, convicted, sincere leadership has been almost completely lost. So the heads of companies, while they need to communicate with their shareholders and investors and their employees and their customers, I think they feel that the digital practice basically and channels have overtaken their own personal requirement to speak. And I think that a lot could be said for when you have, for example, and this is not just Boeing by any stretch of the imagination, but when you have some catastrophes, for example, or you have things happen in your company or your industry that need to be discussed and need to be also, I think, communicated in a way where those looking for, I think there's a desperate feeling that we need to hear from our leaders. We need to hear from, and I'm not just talking about political leaders, but we need to hear about why they made these decisions, why they feel the way they do, and are they really committed to us as the investors or as the employees. And I think that unfortunately, over the past probably 5 years, where it's become more acute, there's been a drawdown on leadership and communication.
Got it. Connecting that to business and growth, what trend in business growth excites you most right now, and what do you think is overhyped?
Well, I think today there's just absolutely tremendous opportunity to address what markets are looking for digitally. A lot of digital solutions are almost, you could say, well, let's look at issues like fuel. Let's look at issues of how you build housing. Let's look at issues of how you handle energy. I think today more than ever, there is a feeling that we can solve our problems or challenges with new solutions. And I think that's one of the most wonderful things going on right now. So let's say, for example, right now, we know that in order to manufacture the digital equipment that we need to have, both for cars, for laptops, for all kinds of things, that we need rare metals. And as a result of that, we need to accelerate the mining for these metals, which is, by the way, all over the world. So you have a multilateral business challenge right there, because there's a big question about, will you be able to actually create the digital devices and services that you need to have, lacking the kind of minerals that are needed? Well, there are two ways to look at this, which I think are very interesting, and I think that those are rising to the surface. And that is, are there new ways to create these pieces of machinery, you'd say, these physical things, by metaphysical solutions? And I think this is where we're going, and I think it's absolutely fascinating. And it's also reflective of something that I learned from Ronald Reagan, and that is, he always asked this question. And he didn't always do it verbally, but I could tell when he was, because he thought this way every day. And this is what it is. And don't forget this. He asked this question: what is really going on? What is really going on? So he read his big, thick briefing books. He was advised by a lot of people, but he kept his own confidence, not in an egotistic way at all, because he had no ego whatsoever. He left the White House the same person who entered in. So he didn't care what people thought of him, which is absolutely critical for a leader. It doesn't mean that you're harsh or you're cold, or that you're tossing away your relationships with other people that you need to have relationships with, but it means that you're not vulnerable, and that you can attempt to answer the question, what is really going on? So if you talk about anything in terms of the need for mining, the need for drilling, the need for safety regulations, the need for all of these different things, you need to ask the question, what is really going on here? And can it be done more efficiently? Can it be done more economically? And I think that the people who are the best creators of companies, and the people that are looking to the future in terms of what the marketplace needs, are the people that are the winners in the end. They're not just addressing what is on the surface as needed. For example, there's a lot of discussion about food safety and food quality. Now, this is a problem that the advanced economies have. I recognize that just getting food to people in certain places in the Middle East and Africa, for example, it's a whole different issue. That's just getting the basic food that's necessary there. But the question is, how do you solve a problem in a way that is going to be durable and accepted and successful, without buying into, let's say, worn out strategies, or strategies that people are looking to get you to subscribe to that aren't necessarily the best strategies? And another whole industry here, which is related to that, is healthcare. So you see today in the US, and I think not exclusively, you see arguments about, are these medicines, are these ways of dealing with people's physical problems, are these the only solutions, and are they the best solutions? And is it the solution that's going to make the most money for the pharmaceutical and the healthcare industry? I think it's very important to ask those questions, because ultimately, in a free market economy, the user is going to decide. Ultimately, not they may be captive to certain kind of medical devices and all of that sort of thing. But if you ask the question, what is really going on, and you strive to solve the real problem, and I'm talking about the real problem here, obviously you have to take care of, while you're figuring out the real problem and the real solution, obviously you have to keep producing things that are needed by people all over the world, no question about that. But the real leaders are those that are going to be able to answer that question and can see into the future. And I think you see particularly those that are creating new and that are creating new devices, that are creating new ways to, for example, one would be what we've seen in terms of battery-driven cars rather than cars driven by uh, gasoline, electricity. So the question really is, and I remember this from a couple of decades ago, that someone in France, for example, had found a solution for actually running cars using water. And it was tested. Obviously, it didn't make market standards and it didn't really go anyplace. But I'm using this as an example. I think there are solutions for everything, but to be trapped by investment, and either by investment means or what you think is going to be successful in terms of making money, isn't necessarily in the end. It might be a short-term win, but the real win has to be understanding, applying, developing, and making available to consumers, and I'm talking about industry consumers as well as individuals, the real long-term solution.
Yeah, no, James, thank you so much. Great advice. Now, last question, final reflection. Um, you do a lot of coaching, mentoring. We work with a lot of first-time CEOs. If you were mentoring a first-time CEO today, what is one piece of advice you would insist they take to heart?
I think the first thing that I actually in coaching, and I love to do this with entrepreneurs and established CEOs, is to go back to that vivid example of building a bridge. And the way to do that is always remember this: tell a story. So the first thing I advise, in fact, I have a speech here on my desk that someone wants me to comment on. You should always start by saying, I'm going to start this afternoon by telling you a little story. So what happens is that immediately grabs the attention of the audience, right? The audience needs to know that you care about them. Otherwise, just think about this: if you go to a play, or you go to a musical gathering and you have the musicians there, but they're not playing the music that you're interested in, you may get up and walk away. You may feel that these musicians don't care about me; they're just playing the music that they're interested in. Musicians do, they carry success in concerts. Why? Because they play the music that the audience likes. Now, a CEO can't always deliver a message that's considered favorable by the audience, but you can deliver it in a way that the audience feels that you're sincere about their welfare. And it isn't just saying, when accidents happen and you see these CEOs or, the security people, or, you have terrible accidents or floods or something that happen, you always see this, well, we're praying for these people. Well, that's very nice. And I hope that they are praying, but it doesn't really do what they think it does. You have to give an impression that you care. And how do you do that? By really caring.
Great advice. Thank you so much, James. So this is a wrap. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was great discussing a variety of topics with you. We'll look forward to having you back at some other point soon.